from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
I welcome you back to yet another week in our series entitled An Affair with the Arts and Humanities. For any new viewers that are with us, recently we celebrated the 25th anniversary of the North Idaho College Popcorn Forum series, in which that was the topic. We've been most fortunate over several weeks now to bring you some of those distinguished guests that were at that symposium. As to today's program, it is a rare occasion when one gets to interview someone that is recognized around the world for their distinguished work. And in fact, today we're going to be interviewing only the second guest that we've ever had that won the prestigious MacArthur Foundation Award that does recognize the work that the individual contributes to world enjoyment and achievements. And our guest is Gunther Schuller, who won that award in 1991. Our distinguished guest has developed a musical career that ranges from composing and conducting to his extensive work as an educator and administrator, a music publisher, record producer, and author. I would like to describe our guest as a Renaissance man. As a conductor, Mr. Schuller travels throughout the world in leading major ensembles in a very wide range of music, and certainly that's why he is so accomplished, because he has this appreciation for all music. In 1967, Mr. Schuller was appointed president of the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston. He was recognized, as I said, in 1991 with the MacArthur Award. Mr. Schuller's composition of Reminiscence and Reflections also brought him another rather outstanding, to say the least, award with the Pulitzer Prize for Music in 1994. He has won other awards such as the Guggenheim Fellowship and also the Rogers and Hammerstein Award, and he has many honorary degrees. Our guest is editor-in-chief of Jazz Masterworks Editions, and he is the co-director of the Smithsonian Jazz Masterworks Orchestra in Washington, D.C. And my final point of the introduction is that our guest in his field has done something that very few people do, and that is he really brings in a complete new area of understanding when he developed what was called the third stream, which is a combination of classical and jazz. And I like his description that it's become a delta of streams. And with that, Mr. Schuller, we're delighted to have you on the program.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And I'm so pleased to have three panel members to interview our distinguished guest today. First of all is Janelle Berg, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho. And I also should add that she has degrees in music. And next to her is Steve Schink, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And we're very happy to welcome to the program today Terry Jones from our faculty in the music department. And I want to say to Terry Jones, thank you for making it possible that Mr. Schuller came to spend this wonderful week with us.
I don't know if I'm responsible, but you're welcome.
And with that, I'll ask Janelle to commence our questioning.
Mr. Schuller, it's a privilege to have you here and to be able to talk with you. One of the things that I once read in an interview that you had given to a reporter was that you said, I like all kinds of music. You spoke to the students today about diversity. Can you fill us in a little bit about your background? How was it that you came to be both formally and informally educated in so many different kinds of music? I think it gives us all license to like many different kinds of music, and it reaffirms our interests in all the sounds.
Not that you need license. You can do it on your own. You don't have to get an imprimatur from me. Well, I can't explain how that happened. I came from a very musical background. My father was a violinist in the New York Philharmonic, but strictly classical-oriented, classical music. And specifically how I ended up in jazz and becoming interested in a multiplicity of other musical traditions, I really don't know. It happened very early in my life. All I know is that I heard Duke Ellington, for example, or Count Basie on the radio when I was 12 or 13, and I said, wow, this is great music. And other people were trying to tell me that this was degenerate music, cheap music, bad music, whatever. And I couldn't reconcile those comments with what I was hearing. And that just began a lifelong exploration, which is still going on, of listening to all kinds of musics. I mean, from jazz, I went into a host of what we call ethnic or vernacular musics, popular musics around on the face of this globe. There's tens of thousands of musics on this globe. And we have tended to segregate things too much into little pigeonhole enclaves, and we say this is good music and this is bad music. You know, I would have none of that, and I cannot explain to you how intellectually I came to that. I just did, by my ears. I mean, Ellington's music. Ellington is the greatest composer in jazz. Not only great because he wrote many, many, many masterpieces, but he wrote nearly 2,000 pieces, which is extraordinary. And when I heard his music, in terms of the quality of the music and what his musicians in his orchestra were producing and what he had composed, I could make an exact equation of those pieces with the pieces I knew in the classical literature. The only difference was they swung, which Beethoven symphonies don't usually, and they were a different instrumentation, and the trumpet players used funny mutes and things like that, and they scooped notes, and they did things you don't do in classical music. But other than that, it seemed to me, from a creative point of view, the imagination, the creativity, the invention, the perfection of the harmonies and the melodies seemed to me on the same level as a Beethoven symphony. People find that heretic to say that, you know. So, but I can't explain it. It's just one of those things that happened to me, and I'm very glad it did.
Steve Sheen.
Mr. Schuller, could you explain to us a little bit about, and this is again drawn from your program today, but the difference that you make between the American music, American European tradition in music as art for art's sake, as opposed to all other musics which might be described as more practical or purposeful in nature?
Well, that is in fact the case. The only musical tradition that developed towards something what we call art music, where we sit down in a concert hall or a nightclub or something, we listen to the music, that's the European, and by transportation from Europe, American, that's our tradition. And jazz fits into that too, by the way. But in the rest of the world, there are no words for art as a music. And all those musics, whether in Africa or India or Asia or South America or wherever you go, they are either they are functional music, utilitarian music that relate to birth and death and working and other activities of normal life. And so a music separate from life does not exist in those traditions. Beginning to be a little bit, let's say in South America, where you have dance music that is more entertainment music and is not necessarily spiritually or intellectually so connected to daily activities. But in principle, that's the case. Whether it's Eskimo music or whether it's African tribal dances or ritualistic music from the Aborigines in Australia or whatever. And the European tradition is the only one that has developed in such a way as to focus on this individuality of creativity, a Beethoven, a Duke Ellington, a Tchaikovsky, you know. And and in that tradition, you're supposed to constantly explore, constantly create new things, whereas all those other traditions, some of the music from India and China, for example, is 5,000 years old. There is not to be any renewal of those traditions. And they are indeed, as far as we can tell, about the same as they were when they started a millennia ago. Fascinating separation between European and the rest of the world.
Terry Jones.
Dr. Stewart, would you tell us just a little bit about the Smithsonian Project and what kind of launched you into the preservation of a lot of Ellington stuff in that whole orchestra and how that all came about?
Well, there again, I can't explain why I did that, because I started when I was 17 in Cincinnati. I was first horn in the orchestra, and I started transcribing Duke Ellington's music because you couldn't buy it. You still can't buy it. There's only 6 scores of Duke Ellington out of 2,000 pieces that you can buy commercially. And I think that's a tragedy. That's a disgrace when you consider that jazz is our one homegrown American music, and furthermore music that has gone to the rest of the world, you know. So I just became, again, fascinated by the sounds that I heard on those records, and I wanted to see them. I could hear them very well, I have good ears, but I also wanted to see what it looked like if I wrote it down, as in a Brahms symphony, you know. Well, so I started doing that, and I was alone in the world at that time doing such things. But 40 years later, let's say, lots and lots of people are now getting into this transcribing of music, which exists only on records, and which you cannot go into a store and buy, and therefore you can't perform it.
Right.
And so I've been pushing for publication of such music for quite some time, including at the Smithsonian, and we are embarked on such a project. But we are also, prior to that, embarked on the project of performing the music as repertory. That is to say, recreating as imaginatively and as respectfully and truthfully as we can with our talents, limited talents, the music of the great jazz masters in live performance at the Smithsonian. And we've done now 4 years of concerts with that. And it isn't very much different, finally, from playing a Brahms symphony, except there you play from, well, you play from written notes there, and in the case of, let's say, when we do an Ellington concert, we also play from written notes that have been transcribed from the record. Every little fly-speck has been copied off of that record. You know. It's a laborious job, but it needs to be done. Because if Ellington is such a great composer, perhaps our greatest American composer, how can it be that this music should not be available?
Right.
It's going to die if we don't perform it live. Any music tradition that isn't performed live atrophies eventually and disappears.
Dr. Schuler, individuals like yourself that have pioneered throughout history and have developed a theory and its application and so forth are always criticized at first because they're ahead of their time. They're visionary. And you have already been vindicated in your lifetime, and many people don't have that experience. But would you explain to our viewers more about the concept of the third stream and how you looked at both classical music and jazz and moving into this third component?
Well, of course, the term third stream, which I happen to invent, is a very simplistic term describing the offspring of two other mainstreams, classical music and jazz. That's what I was mostly involved with at the time that I did this. This was in the 50s. So if classical is a first stream and jazz is a second stream, at least chronologically, then they get together, cross-fertilize, and they beget a child, and that could be the third stream. And it was that simple. So it meant bringing together musical traditions and the techniques involved in those to create something that could otherwise not be born, that otherwise could not be created. It's the confluence of these two musics at a given time in the hands of a talented composer or improviser that makes this third stream possible. If the composer, by the way, is not very good, then it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't amount to a hill of beans, you know. But if he is really creative and really involved with both traditions very seriously, very deeply, then something very remarkable may come out of that. And what I was explaining this morning is from this original concept of classical and jazz, it now has expanded on the vernacular side. Let's say the jazz originally was a folk music, let's face it, back in the late 19th century, and it developed into an art music. But jazz as a category of vernacular or folk music, entertainment music, and there being thousands of other such musics in all the different countries and continents of this globe, bringing all those musics together. i.e., I've always been a musician, I guess a philosopher, who wants to bring peoples and musics together. I hate this segregation, you know, and all this little pigeonholing, and then we make it worse by put labels on those. This is good and this is not good. And I spent my whole life bringing music together. And third stream is just a sort of symbol, paradigm of that concept. And it's working beautifully because now, finally, even the record companies who only think commercially, usually they just think about how much money they can make, they have finally discovered, and they don't call it third stream, they now call it world music, you know. Well, great, I don't care what they call it. I have no priority claim on this third stream label, but it's happening, and I see more and more musicians in this country who, because of recordings and television, what you see and hear, on radio and recordings and things like that, who are mixing these different traditions by choice. I mean, no one forces anybody to do anything, including that. But if you are enamored of a classical tradition and you're also a jazz musician and you happen to come from let's say, a Greek background and you know bouzouki music, you know, from the cradle on up, why shouldn't you combine those three things, you know? And so new profiles can be created from the most diverse kinds of sources, you know. And I mean, I can't imagine, but I could imagine maybe in the future Eskimo and Kazakhstan and 12-tone music. I don't know, something like that. Why not?
Well, yes, we'll continue to be visionary. I do have one more question. I can't resist this because, among other things, as I introduce you as a Renaissance person, you also are a philosopher. And I get from your comments the idea, too, that through an appreciation and identification of music around the world, and as you're indicating its integration, does that not also, through the power of music, affect all human relationships in other areas, such as in politics and other fields?
Oh, absolutely. I think music and the arts in general are the one human activity that can bring peoples together, and where all differences between people, physiological differences, political, social differences that have been inherited somehow will disappear. I mean, I've experienced that myself so many times when I've met with composers who were our enemies, Russian composers, or such things. And it always becomes suddenly a level playing field, and we're all happy together making music, and communicating with each other through the music. It's amazing.
Thank you, Janelle Burke.
Some people believe that musicians in America are sort of on a triangle, and there is a vast number down here, and we go up to an apex where perhaps the performing musician, the conductor himself, is at the very top, classical music. And yet I've heard it said by another professor that indeed the most influential musician in America is the street corner musician, the person who teaches, who deals with students, because they expose more people to music than actually the conductor does. How would you respond to that comment? Do you think there's a place for all of those kinds of musicians in America?
Well, that's a touchy and complicated subject. The first question I always ask is not what category of music is or what label it has, but how good is it? How great is it? Because as I was postulating this morning in my talk, every kind of music has the potential to be great, depending on who creates it, improvised or composed or whatever, but also every music has the potential to be terrible. And there's probably been more terrible music created through the history of mankind than good music. I mean, let's face it, geniuses in music, geniuses in painting, in literature, if an era has one or two of those, that's already a miracle, And then you have a lot of lesser talents filling up the field. So I've got to ask, not what is the name of the music, but I've got to hear it and be able to say, aha, that is great creative music by such and such criteria. Now, the problem is today that there is, unfortunately, a lot of music that has, in the European context of art music, has almost nothing to do with art. It is a strictly commercial music made to make money and to entertain a mass public. That is usually not a music of very great quality. It is, again, in a sense, a functional music, So I don't know what you meant by street corner musicians, but for example, I will just come right out and say that the rap music of today is the lowest form of degenerate music making that I have ever heard in my life. Why? Because it isn't even music. Rock music, until quite recently, had melody, had harmony. It had rhythm, of course, also, and it may have had words, song or whatever. Rap took away melody and harmony. There's nothing left, just talking and rhythm. And it's so successful and so powerful because rhythm is the single most powerful element that moves us human beings. We can do without a lot of things, but we can't do without rhythm. And the rappers have either consciously or unconsciously realized and figured out that all you really do need is rhythm. But that's not music. And I'm very happy to discuss rap music, well, rap, I won't say music, rap as a social phenomenon, as a political movement, as a protest movement, as a ghetto movement, all kinds of things that are valid about it. But please don't ask me to discuss it as music. So, because it isn't music. Whereas, earlier, I mean, the Beatles and lots of wonderful rock music, Jefferson Airplane, The Who, and so on, were all, to some extent, music. It was not music as great as Mozart or Beethoven, but it was music, and you could discuss it on some musical terms. So when this professor says to you street music, I don't know exactly what he means.
And I'm talking also about now teachers, not necessarily just street music, but I'm talking about, I'm not talking about that as a term of art, I'm talking about that as a general kind of thing. The person who teaches, the person who is a church organist, all of those kinds of people, that those people are the people who expose more individuals to music than probably any other form.
I don't even know that that's true, because that statement doesn't incorporate recordings. Mm-hmm. Recordings which are made mostly by professional musicians. Thousands, particularly in the CD era. I mean, we have recordings coming out of the woodworks, you know. So I'm sure that in popular and classical and jazz and so on, the major influence are things like recordings and live performance to some extent. However, all of that is somewhat short-circuited nowadays, I'm speaking of the last 20 years, by the lack of anything like that on television. Unfortunately, network television is a cultural desert, and it used to be an oasis. So that to the extent that if you're looking for culture, I don't know whether it's, I don't care whether it's Picasso or Beethoven or Charlie Parker or El Greco or whatever, you won't find it on network television. I mean, it's a disaster area. And you have to go to public television. And that's being talked about, maybe being stripped of its power. So this is a very complicated subject you bring up. The bottom line on this is, for me, that I will not separate music, as I said already, into categories, neatly packaged little categories and pigeonholings and then putting labels on it. I will look at all music across the spectrum, all the way from the simplest, what shall we say, folk ethnic music to the most complicated classical or jazz music, in terms of whether it is great or not so great. That's where the separation is. And I find, my observation all my life is that musics that are made primarily or exclusively for making money, which is what Madonna does, which is what most of those people do, that is very likely not going to be a great music or a great art music. I'm sorry to say that, but it's so embedded in our culture that one has to speak up about these issues now. Because I feel very frustrated that some kid growing up in Iowa, who's 9 years old, is being hooked by some very poor pop or rock music and will never have a chance to hear Beethoven, very likely, or never hear Charlie Parker or Duke Ellington. That makes me very sad.
Steve Sheen.
That's a perfect segue into my question. Unhappily, our television audience is not going to have the opportunity that the audience at North Idaho College had to hear those wonderful excerpts from music around the world that you shared with us today. But you made, I think, a very important point about libraries and conservatories that you might want to share with them.
Yes, I was urging the students in the audience to absolutely, while they're in school, or whether in this school or Indiana University or Michigan University or the New England Conservatory, I don't care where, to make full use of the fantastic resources that now sit in these universities, libraries, record libraries, book libraries, music libraries. And I say that with a certain vehemence because as I travel around the country and do a lot of residencies and lectures and stuff like that, I notice that most of these young people studying music or whatever they're studying don't seem to take advantage of that. My God, when I was a kid, there wasn't anything like that. There were maybe 3 recordings of the Beethoven Fifth. Now there are 97. And nobody listens to the 97. We sure listen to the 3 that were there, you know. It's as if because of the plethora of available things that everybody sort of takes it for granted and doesn't bother to look at it, you know. I mean, there's so much you can learn from listening to hundreds of hours of great recordings. And I think the universities in America are incredible resources in that respect. And I just see that it's not being particularly taken advantage of.
Are you satisfied that, and the number of musics around the world is staggering,
yeah.
Has there been a pretty systematic effort to record those musics? Are you satisfied that they are largely represented in the libraries to the extent you'd like them to be?
There is not any music that you cannot find in some recording. You might have to look a little more diligently for some obscure music, Afghanistani mountain shepherd music, I don't know, you know, but I know it exists. and it's just your business to find out and find it. No, this all started, of course, early in the century when Bartók went, Béla Bartók went to Africa. We all know about his Hungarian and Balkan researches with Zoltán Kodály, but hardly anybody knows or remembers that Bartók first went to Tunisia and Morocco in 1911 with the most primitive kind of recording equipment and started recording the Arabic music of the north of Africa. Well, since then, there's been a crescendo of activity of what we call field recordings. They began to go to Africa in the 30s and record all these, the Pygmies and the Hutus and the Tutus and everybody else in the West African music, and Indian music and South American music. By now, it's another delta. I mean, it's a stream of musics that in the CD era it's just reached a climactic point where even I cannot keep up with it anymore. You know, it's just too much. But yes, it is all available. I don't care how obscure it is.
Terry Jones.
Just simply, I want to have you talk a little bit about the Sandpoint Institute and the Sandpoint concerts. I know a lot of people are probably familiar with the concerts, but maybe not the Institute, and I feel like we need to talk about it because it's primarily your interest in that allowed us to kind of, you know, pull you down a little further south and get you here. So I think it's only just cause that we pay that a little bit of due.
And talking about pulling south, I'd like to pull people from Coeur d'Alene north to go to Sandpoint this coming summer. Well, yes, for me the most important, and I'm happy to say for my board, my trustees, the most important part of the Sandpoint Festival to us is the educational part, where we train young people in a sort of, in the old days they probably called it a finishing school, you know, polishing your talents in the final stages before you go out into the profession in various areas, chamber music, composition, jazz, and conducting, which I teach. And the jazz is particularly interesting to me because I was for 22 years artistic director of Tanglewood, where I was in charge of the school. And the one thing that the Boston Symphony, who was the parent organization, wouldn't let me do was jazz. So I feel very much relieved to be able to do it here. I've been here for 10 years now at Sandpoint.
On that note, I'll have to bring our program to conclusion. Dr. Schuler, on behalf of our panel and our staff, we want to thank you for being with us on this program, and also your outstanding lecture to the audience. And also, while you were here, you conducted the Spokane Symphony, a portion for a ragtime performance at our institution. And as I indicated at the beginning of the program, this is our 25th anniversary, and you have just been a great centerpiece for that celebration after a quarter of a century on numerous subjects. And one of those, of course, over the years has been the arts and humanities, and you've been gracious with your time, and it's been a very informative program, and I thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we shall join you again next week as we continue this discussion of the arts and the humanities, and we hope you'll join us at that time. Until then, we wish you a very good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.